Let's build the countdown timer next. If we look at the timer as a whole, it basically consists of a few components: the progress bar, the buttons, and also the title. From the previous lessons, we have already built the building blocks to construct this timer component, and I will consider this timer component as a container. So let's create a new directory in our container folder, and I'll call it timer, and we'll create a new component called basetimer.jsx. Now let's talk about the API of this timer component. On a high level, we need to define how long will the timer last. So we'll need to define a timeout prop, which is basically the duration of the timer. We also need to provide the user the flexibility to do something when a timer is completed or when a timer is stopped or started. And that means we should expect the user to pass in these three functions in a prop. Next, we'll also have an autoplay prop, which will be a boolean, and when set to true, the timer should run automatically by itself. And last but not least, we should have a title. Now the first thing that we want to do in a component is to set up a clock, and that means we need to create a reactive variable which represents the total time remaining, and for each passing second we'll decrease this number by 1. So let's create a new state called total time, and I'll give it an initial value which is equal to our timeout prop. Next, we'll create a function to start the timer. The start timer function is basically a wrapper around the setInterval function. So what we gotta do here is to decrease the total time state by 1 for every passing second. And that means within the setInterval function, we will call the setTotalTimeSetter function, and we'll pass a callback function to it to handle the setting logic. So the first step is to calculate the time remaining by subtracting total time by 1. If the time remaining is less than or equal to 0, then we should stop the timer. We could call the clearInterval function to clear the timer, however, we need a timer ID. Let's create a new variable in the outer scope here to store the timer ID of our setInterval. So back to our if statement, now we can simply pass the timer ID into the clearInterval function to stop the timer, and we'll return 0 if the time remaining is less than 0. Otherwise, we'll return the time remaining as the new total time state. And that is pretty much our start timer function. Next, when a component was first mounted and if autoplay is set to true, we should automatically call the start timer function. Let's create a use effect for that. So the use effect will simply check if the autoplay is true. If yes, then we will run the function. Now the timer can be paused or stopped by the user when the corresponding button is clicked. Let's create a few more functions to pause, resume, or stop the timer. We will also create 2 more states to handle the state of the timer, which are the pause state and the started state. And I'll set them to false by default. And now, to pause the timer, we'll simply set the isPausing state to true, and also stopping the interval timer. On the other hand, resuming the timer means to set the isPausing state back to false and calling the start timer function again. Stopping the timer means that we'll reset the total time back to the initial timeout prop and also set the has started state into false. And last but not least, we'll clear the timer. And we should also set the has started state into true in the start timer function. Once we've got all these helper functions, we can now start to build our user interface. I'll create a function to render the buttons, and based on the state of the timer, we will show different buttons accordingly. So when the timer is not started, we would like to show the play button, and when the timer has started, we want to show the pause and stop buttons, and when it is paused, then we want to show the play and stop button. We can easily handle these conditions by using some if statements. Let me turn on my 10x speed hack to quickly write the scaffold of our code. We will be using our round button custom component here that we created in a previous episode. And we'll call this render buttons functions in the return statement of this component. Let's quickly load it inside our home component and we will view our button in the browser. Whoops, we got an error. Seems like I forgot to import the useEffect hook function. And now once we have fixed it, we're able to see our start button in the browser. Let's quickly implement the logic to change the state of the timer. In theory, when we click on the start button, the timer should start. But before we attach any event listener to our round buttons, we should give our base timer a timeout prop. I'll give it 10 seconds for now, and back inside our base timer component, we will start attaching the event listener to each of the round buttons. Clicking on the start button now will start the timer, and the pause and stop buttons will show up. If I click on the pause button, then the play button will show, and if I click on the stop button, the whole cycle should reset. And when I click on the start button again, I should see the pause and stop button all over again. And it seems like I have made a mistake. When we stop the timer, we should also reset the pause status. And when we click on the play button, we should resume the timer rather than starting the timer. Let's try clicking on the buttons again. It works a lot better. Next, we'll display the remaining time in a countdown clock and a progress bar. Let's start with the progress bar. This should be quite straightforward. We just need to load our progress bar component that we created in a previous lesson and put in the appropriate percentage. We need to find a way to express the remaining time in terms of percentage. Let's create a helper function for that. To get a percentage, we can simply divide the time remaining, which is the total time, by timeout, and multiply the result by 100 to express it in percentage. And then we'll call the function in the percent prop of the progress bar component. And if we click on the start button now, we can see that the progress bar is working. Great! Our next task is to show the remaining time in a countdown clock. And the countdown clock will show the time in a format of minute, and second. Let's create a component for that. I'll create a new component in the same folder and I'll call it countdown clock. And we'll let this component to accept a prop called time remaining, which is in seconds. And within the component, we'll calculate the minutes remaining and also the seconds remaining from the time remaining prop. And in the HTML, we'll return an H1 where we'll show the time in a format of minute, seconds as mentioned before. Now we're padding our minutes and seconds so that we are always getting 2 digits. Let's also quickly style our H1 and we'll load it back inside our base timer component. Let's click on the start button and our timer is now counting down along with the progress bar. Beautiful! And now let's quickly use some magic to style our base timer component. And lastly, we should run the onStop, onStart, and onFinish functions in the appropriate places. And that is basically it. Our base timer container is now completed. I think that's a good time to stop here. We'll continue in the next lesson. If you would like to see more content, consider supporting us by becoming a member at my website, Acadea.io. It is similar to Patreon, but in return, you get a lot of premium tutorials and lessons. If you can't become a member, that's totally fine. We are just happy that you are here. We spend a lot of time and energy to produce high quality videos for you. Feel free to check out our other videos on YouTube, and if you can leave a thumbs up, you will really make my day. If you subscribe, I would jump for joy, and I'll make more videos for you. Thanks for your support, and I'll see you next time.